This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate. Brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and my guest today is a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the London School of Economics and a world-renowned sociologist of religion. She participated in an international conference at the Van Leer Institute entitled Holy Lands and Sacred Histories in New Religious Movements. Professor Eileen Barker, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello.
So it is really hard to think of a social phenomenon that's more pervasive than religion, both in terms of its universality and its longevity. Religion is virtually as widespread and as old as humankind itself. And what's even more interesting is that it's uniquely human, unlike solidarity or family values and things relating to that can be found in animals as well. So what really is the secret of religion? Where did it come from? What sort of need, biological or not, did it address?
Well, there are lots of theories about that. In fact, there are some theories that elephants follow some kind of religious ritual and things when one of their number dies. But I don't know about that. It depends how you define religion, I suppose. As far as the origins go, there are a lot of evolutionists who think that if you have the kind of believing gene and believing in a group, the two things going together, that the group shares a common God, then this provides cohesion and it makes you stronger as a group, and therefore it would have some sort of evolutionary value. But of course, you do find, you're right, you find religion in nearly all societies. Not all. There are one or two societies that anthropologists have... I was afraid you were going to ask me that because I can't remember.
Okay.
But my anthropologist... I remember Mary Douglas would always insist that there was one that had been studied by, I want to say Boaz, but I'm not sure. Anyway, she insisted there were societies that didn't have religion. And of course, there have been atheistic societies, but they haven't been terribly successful. Mm-hmm. Religion usually does pop up, but it doesn't, of course, always lead to cohesion. It can lead to bloody battles as well. If my God isn't the same as your God, and my God's right and your God's wrong, then my God might tell me to kill you because you believe in the wrong God or gods. Mm-hmm. So nobody really knows. Nobody's identified the religious gene in breaking down the DNA or anything. But it's plausible that if you share common values and a feeling that you belong together as a group because there's something you share and others don't.
The interesting thing about it is that in all of them, or in most of them, correct me if I'm wrong, there's this transcendental element, that the God exists somewhere and is separate from the group. Not so much, it doesn't have to live in heaven or anything, but the fact that it's not flesh and blood, just like the rest of the elements in the group. Where did this distinction come from?
Well, I wish you wouldn't ask me where they came from because I wasn't there and I don't know. Some people say they do.
What is the explanation?
Well, even the explanation. It's just not true that all of them are transcendental. I mean, is Confucianism, is Buddhism a religion? They don't have a god. And then there are, of course, pagan religions which are pantheistic and believe that nature is God. There might be lots of deities that they believe in, and or they might just see the trees and the mountains as being God and spiritual. Native American religions are very interesting that way. You can have spirits or not spirits. And then people can sort of play around with, well, is that really a religion or is it not a religion?
Exactly.
What do you mean?
So if they're so different from one another, how do we know they all fall under the category of religion and not ideology?
Well, you say, how do we know? I mean, we decide. Concepts are man-made, usually, sometimes women-made, but usually man-made. And we say, by religion I mean XYZ. Now, if you mean belief in a supernatural being, then a lot of Buddhism isn't a religion. If you say I mean a belief system that joins people together, then you can include Marxism and all sorts of ideologies. And so it depends how you draw the boundaries. You as a society, it isn't just the individual, but what we mean by, and as an academic, definition for one purpose might not be the same as a definition for another purpose. I mean, I study new religious movements. Now, what is new? A lot of movements that are called new religious movements in Britain, for example, have existed for hundreds or even thousands of years in India or Japan or something. So for my purposes, I mean by new religious movement one that has a first-generation membership. The members are converts, but there are a whole lot of difficulties with that. And so you have to get clear what it is that you're actually talking about, that you can point to and say, oh, I see that is a convert or
So is it a matter of much debate among religion scholars?
Yes, and a lot of hopeless debate because people think there is the true answer. But of course, definitions are more or less useful, not more or less true. So once you accept that, then you say, well, for purposes of finding out whether X goes with Y, I will define X in these terms, and then I'll see if Y does occur with it.
So how do you define religions, and how do your colleagues hate you for it?
Hate me for it? That's the new bit, usually. Religions, well, I define it very widely indeed, as I use sort of the Paul Tillich idea of a system of beliefs that answer ultimate questions or address ultimate questions like, who am I? Is there a God? And the answer could be no. What happens after life? It could be nothing. But that deal with questions that are beyond how do I get from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
And what are the contentions in this sort of definition? It seems to me pretty benign and straightforward.
Well, it's useful in that you don't get a hang-up on saying, no, that's not a real religion, because by real religion I mean that you believe in the one God, and they're not a real religion, they're a cult, they're a sect. And the number of times I get asked, is it a cult or is it a genuine religion? So all I can say is, well, what do you mean by a cult? What do you mean by a genuine religion? Mm-hmm. And according to some definitions, it will be one. According to others, it will be both. According to others, it will be neither. And you've got to find out what people are talking about if you want to communicate and if you want to say what something is or is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question about the definitions, the categories between religion, cult, superstition even. They're all somewhere around the same family. You know, if you look at religion and cult, for example, it's a bit like migrants and expats, right? It's essentially the same thing, only one of them is stigmatized and the other isn't. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly in common parlance. We use in sociology of religion the terms cult and sect in opposition to church and denomination, or this has been done, but it's very Christocentric. And it's generally dividing religious movements that are in tension with society and those that are more universal or accepted by society. But nowadays, cult or sect means a religion or a group that I don't like, and very often they'll say, well, it's not a proper religion, even if they believe in a God and fulfill all the definitions of religion that the person who's saying it's not a religion would give you if you ask what they mean by religion.
Mm-hmm. What about secularism? I mean, it is the elephant in the room, in a way, isn't it? It's something, it's really the ground zero of modern society in relation to religion. How do you position your inquiry in relation to secularism?
Well, that's a big one. Big elephant. Several elephants, actually. A few rhinoceroses as well, I think. It depends where you're looking and what you mean by it. I mean, simply, well, it means long term, but people usually mean the decline of religion. Well, do you mean the decline of going to church, or do you mean the decline of belief? In America, a whole lot of people still go to church and still say that they believe in religion. And you wouldn't. This is getting slightly less now, but in the 60s, when people were talking about secularization taking place, that was generally in Western Europe. And then you've got the state-imposed secularism of the former Soviet Union and indeed in China now, where Christianity is growing enormously. Are you talking about the beliefs, the organizations, whether people go to church or some place of worship, a synagogue or a temple or what have you? You've got to sort all that out. And it's very different in different countries, and they don't all go together, those things. Some countries, everybody belongs to a religion. Scandinavia, nearly until recently, they all belonged to the national church, but they didn't believe and they didn't go to church. But they would still define themselves in that way. Sometimes it's very tied with nationalism. The Russian Orthodox Church assumes that all Russians must be Orthodox or else they're not proper Russians. So it's very complicated, and going back to what I said rather boringly before, you've got to know what you mean by. For secularization, you mean decline in religion. What do you mean by religion? What part of, or what aspect of religion?
So is it really the dichotomy between the public and the personal, the individual? I mean, the place that religion played both in our state of mind as individuals or in society?
Well, that's one distinction. I mean, some people say that religion has become privatized. This was quite popular in the 60s and 70s, people like Brian Wilson, that it's just become a private matter. But then, I mean, look at the Middle East. You couldn't say that it was particularly private there. And it has been of increasing importance. But then some people say, well, that's not really religion. If you look at something like ISIS, that's a misuse of religion. But if you look at the people who bombed the Twin Towers, I believe they believed, if you read their diaries and things. So again, you've got to ask particular questions, and these broad questions, sort of macro level, you get your answers, which are nice and simple, but just plain wrong if they're that simple, because the world isn't that simple.
Right. Can religious person be a sociologist of religion, or does it require...
Oh, yes. One point I looked at all the sociologists of religion I knew, and half of them were and half of them weren't. I think it would be very difficult if you were a real fundamentalist and you knew what was the right religion, as opposed to, a more liberal, there are many ways kind of religion. But certainly there are. I mean, that's just empirically true.
Mm-hmm. And you don't think that it poses some kind of challenge to their inquiry?
It doesn't seem to. It's difficult to say. They will say that if you... I mean, when I study a whole lot of minority religions, and quite often I'm told, well, you can't really understand unless you believe. And so it's a disadvantage in their eyes for me not to be a believer. But funnily enough, I've found that those people who do believe very often don't give you the feel of the religion, the sort of smell and the taste of it, as much as those who don't, because they take that for granted and they're very keen to show that they're being scientific. So in a sense, they're more sort of objective and removed than those of us who don't believe and who sort of try and explain through a more empathic kind of understanding why people might want to join, which is sort of obvious to them in a sense, so they don't say it. So funnily enough, it seems to work the other way around in some ways, but not everybody would agree with me on that.
But for you, it really serves your purpose well, right? I mean, because this is essentially what you want to know. Why do people join and what makes them stay?
But it's true that I don't believe, so it's difficult in one sense for me to know. But it also provides me with a big question. Why can people believe some of these, to me, crazy things and do some, to me, crazy things that they do? And I don't find they're crazy people. I find they're ordinary, nice, intelligent people. In fact, a lot of the crazy people I know, the ones who belong to the major faiths, and believing in crazy things doesn't sort of go with being crazy in other areas somehow, which makes it all more interesting and fascinating.
And how do you explain it? Do you have an hypothesis, even if it's not tested yet?
Well, I sometimes reach the stage that everybody's crazy, apart from me, of course. Expect you're crazy too.
I'm the last to deny it.
Have I an hypothesis about...
what makes people believe in what seems to be crazy ideas, even though they're not entirely crazy?
People believe in different things for different reasons. Well, to take the new religious movements for as an example, The sort of person who would become a unificationist, commonly known as a Moonie, is not the same person as would become a Scientologist, which is not the same person as would become a Krishna devotee. Some of them are looking to save the world, make the world a better place. Some of them are looking for a greater relationship with God. Some of them are looking for a community of like-minded people. Are just feeling that they have been called by God, that this is their path, that their mission in life. Some of them are doing it because they're being offered secular things. I mean, Scientology, for example, helps you get off drugs, or they've got something called Criminon, stops you being a criminal, helps you with your communication skills. I mean, we would say, well, secular reasons. They will do the auditing and what have you. Mm-hmm. So even those who join the Unification Church will join for different reasons. Some of them because they want to bring the kingdom of heaven on earth, and some of them because they feel that the theology of the Unification Church provides answers that the Old and New Testaments didn't provide, but it builds beyond it by saying Reverend Moon came to be the Messiah, and so on.
I gather that you based these insights on talking to them, interviewing them,
Yep.
listening to what they have to say about you. You ask them the same question, why do you join? It seems like you take the answers at face value. Is there anything, is there another layer? Do you try to read between the lines, as it were? Try to suss out other more veiled reasons for joining these new social movements?
I do both those things. I take them at face value in one way, but I'm highly suspicious in another way. But I go and live with them quite often and watch their everyday life and see what they're doing, as well as just listening to what they tell me. But I also speak to former members. And I'm so old, I've been doing this for so long, that a lot of the people that I knew as enthusiastic young converts have now left. Some of them hate the movement. Some of them just say, well, this was part of my life. I got something out of it. I'm moving on. I talk to the parents, the relatives, to see how they've changed when they joined. I talk to anybody who thinks they have some information. Now, the narratives that I get are very often highly contradictory. Now, sometimes that's because one of them is lying, but usually it's because they're just seeing things from a slightly different perspective. And all of us see things from a different perspective. I mean, if you see a traffic accident, one person will see a car going very fast, and if you're an old lady and if you're a young man, you might see it going very slowly. And you have certain interests. So there's a group of people who will look at the movements and will just see the bad things, select out the bad things and not notice the normal everyday. The movements themselves are likely just to select the good things and say, we are the truth, the way, and the life, and, we are good. And they don't tell you about the skeletons in their cupboard. The media, of course, want a good, sexy story, and so they will get things that are unusual, novel. They're not going to tell you what they had for breakfast, unless they had something extraordinary for breakfast. So everybody has their own interests, so their own selection of what they see and what they will relate. So what I have to do is listen to as many of these as I can and then try and build up not one picture, but several pictures to see what the mountain looks like from north, south, east and west, but it's the same mountain in some ways.
Do some of these people whose behavior and rituals you study go back to read your articles or books or whatever and offer their feedback?
Yes, sometimes. Not very often. I mean, I wish they did it more. I sort of, you write a whole book about a religion and they don't bother to read it, but some of them do. When I did the book on the Moonies, I remember one person being very disappointed in me because I hadn't proclaimed that Moon was the Messiah. And I had been given the opportunity to know. And he was upset about that. Very often the anti-cultists, as they're called, get very angry with me and say I'm a cult lover because I don't say that they're all wicked and evil. And I'm not always very popular, but I'd be a bit worried if I were.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a badge of honor in a way. I want to go back to a new religious movement who said that what makes them new is rather instrumental.
No, I didn't say what makes them. I say why I call them new.
Yeah, no, what makes them new for the purpose. Yeah, exactly. You understand your definition. The new is the fact that they're first generation. Are there any other traits that are inherently new for the new religious movements as opposed to the old ones?
Well, first of all, one thing that you can say about new religious movements, and in Britain I run a small charity, an educational charity that provides information about new religions, and we have over 1,000 new religious movements that are currently active in Britain. So there are a lot, and lots more we don't know about, I'm sure. And you can't generalise. And I used to say to my students, if anybody can come up with something you can say about them all, I'll give you a big box of Smarties. Do you have Smarties in Israel?
I think so, yeah.
They're sort of something like the Americans called M&Ms. Anyway, I never had to give away that box of Smarties, apart from the fact they were all called a cult. But if you take new as the defining characteristic, as being predominantly first-generation membership, then that means, by definition, they're converts, and converts tend to be far more enthusiastic than people who are born into a religion. Not always, but usually. Secondly, they tend to appeal to an atypical section of the population. In the past, they've sometimes appealed to the politically, socially, economically oppressed. The wave that appeared in the 60s and 70s in the West appealed disproportionately to young adults, good, middle-class, well-educated families, white on the whole, disproportionately, not all of them, the Rastafarians, poor blacks. They tend very often to have a charismatic leader, which means that he or occasionally she can say whatever they want. They're not bound by rules or by tradition and can change their mind at a moment's notice. They tend, but not always, to have a rather dichotomous worldview. Godly, satanic, good, bad, right, wrong, before, afterwards. And socially, they tend to distinguish between them and us. Your primary defining characteristic is that you're a Kabbalist or you're not a Kabbalist, or you're a Mooni or you're not a Mooni. And other identities are secondary to that. They tend to be treated with suspicion by the surrounding society, and they tend to change far more rapidly and radically than old religious movements do. So those are things you can look out for and which give you clues. But as I say, the last thing is that they do change. So when the second generation comes along, they will change usually quite radically. And then society changes. And one thing you've got to realise is that you can't just look at the movement in isolation. You've got to see how it reacts with society, how society reacts to it, both at the state level, the media, relatives, police, etc.
So it seems to me, if I understand you correctly, is that one is a speedboat and the other one is an ocean liner. I mean, the new religious movements as opposed to the old ones.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, the purpose is the same, to bring people across a body of water, but they behave in different ways.
I like that, yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll use that.
All right, you're very welcome. Do the first generation members often, I mean, of course you cannot generalize, but by and large, were they members of another religion before, or were they secular and lost, so they were seeking some kind of spiritual reckoning and found it in a new religious movement?
You're right, it varies. Well, it varies in quite interesting ways. Some of them were brought up in fairly strong religious beliefs, but a lot of them I found were brought up where the parents had different religions. So they were looking for a religious answer to the questions that they were seeking answers for, but they didn't know that there was just one answer. Whereas if they'd just been brought up in a society which didn't have alternatives, they were less likely to be looking for an alternative. They'd be more likely to reject. But again, you can't generalize. And some of the movements sort of approach people in trying to convert them with the more secular. I mean, in California, if you're trying to convert someone, you will use more secular language than you would in Britain. And you would use probably very secular language if you were in Russia in the early 90s.
What do you mean secular language? To avoid talking about God and spirituality?
Partly that, though in the early 90s they were talking about spirituality, but people didn't have any knowledge of the Bible and what have you. But I'm thinking more about saying things like, silly things like giving English lessons, teaching how to become a good capitalist, follow our God, and the riches of the West will fall upon you. Not quite as crude as that, but there was that taste.
I see. So new religious movements, predominantly modern and Western, or do we find them in pre-modern societies, in non-Western societies? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there have always been new religious movements. I mean, Christianity was a new religious movement within Judaism. Islam was a new religious movement. Everything was a new religious movement when it started. So throughout history, obviously. New religious movements have tended to appear at times of social unrest, where the accepted status quo was being questioned, so that the voices crying in the wilderness the whole time often just go unheeded. But when things have changed because of being conquered, crusades, wars, political upheaval, economic problems, natural disasters, anything that upsets and makes people say why and want another answer is likely to produce change. But also in modern society there have been various things like technologically, printing, if we go back that far, gave an opportunity for new religious movements of a particular kind, though most of them were oral. But more recently travel, and then radio, and now social media, internet has made an enormous difference. Just since I started studying in the 70s, incredible difference because of the internet. I was looking at a book that I'm trying to update that I wrote in 1989, and it didn't mention internet once. And the change is fantastic because of the communication across all sorts of social and geographical boundaries. I've forgotten what your question was now.
About whether it's inherently Western and modern.
Oh, no, certainly not. The first lot of new religious movements that Western scholars were interested in were in Japan after the Second World War. A whole lot that had been repressed, like what was to become Soka Gakkai and Shoshu Buddhism, came out and blossomed. Certainly not just in the West. One of the first waves of new religious movements that Western scholars studied came from Japan. It was known as the Rush Hour of the Gods. It's the name of a book by a scholar, Alan McFarland, I think. And lots and lots, scores, hundreds of new religious movements appeared then, and then there were new religions, and now they've got new religions. Africa has been spawning new religious movements for ages. India, almost every movement, religion is... India has got lots of religious movements. Some of them are saying they're old religious movements, but they all have slight changes. There are masses that... I can't think of a single country that hasn't had some sort of new religious movement. Even North Korea has got the odd new religious movement. Don't ask me to say what they're called, but somebody was telling me the other day.
Can they act out in the open?
No. But some people call Kim Il-sung a new religious movement that he founded and, worship of him. But there are new religious movements popping up all over the place, all the time. Vietnam's got Cao Dai and a whole lot of others. Korea has got masses of new religious movements.
Yeah. What kind of inspiration, I would say, or some sort of like a canon, do they search in old religions? You just came back from a conference in Jerusalem that had to do with the Holy Land and sacred histories. How do they feed into the worldview of members of new religious movements? What kind of interaction is there between the two?
Well, a lot of the new religious movements are schisms from old religious movements. For example, the Mormons and the Worldwide Church of God have both got over 400 schisms that I know of, are known. And a lot of them will come out of a particular tradition, like Judaism or Christianity. A lot come out, Protestants, new Protestant type new religions. The Catholic Church is interesting because it's more sort of amoeba-like and envelops and encloses unless they go too far, and then they're not. I mean, I've met 3 different popes in my studies, but they legitimize themselves according to the sort of Vatican rules. Most of them, the Unification Church, which we were talking about, builds on the Old and the New Testaments. And this is a sort of the divine principle. Their theology is a kind of third testament. And you get several third testaments. There's a movement in Serbia, the Vissarians movement of the Third Testament, Church of the Third Testament, I think it's called. So other movements will sort of take from Krishna and develop out of that. You'll get the Kabbalah movements that you've got in Israel that are spreading, Berg's particular, at the moment from Israel. You've got the Messianic Christians, you get syncretism, you've got the Jewboos, the Jew Age. The New Age will draw both from ancient pagan myths and incorporate Jewish beliefs or Christian beliefs or whatever.
So it is virtually impossible to draw a line between the old ones and the new ones. In many ways, both analytically, in terms of tradition.
Yeah, if you're defining them as religions, then they've got religion in common, whatever you're putting in your basket of what religion is. So, only some have been around longer than others.
Yeah.
But some of the ones that have appeared to be just new on the new kids on the block contain a whole lot of old stuff. Nothing's completely new. You get new orderings, some things are completely new. The internet's new.
As you said, Christianity was once a new religious movement.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right, Professor Eileen Barker, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. Thank you very much for joining us today. You're a Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the London School of Economics and a world-renowned sociologist of religion. You are in Israel now for a conference at the Van Leer Institute entitled Holy Lands and Sacred Histories in New Religious Movements. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Our co-host Dalia Shandin will be back with us shortly, but in the meantime, don't forget to follow us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel, and follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.